Good evening, everyone, and good morning, Mr. Carter. It's a great pleasure to meet you, and thanks for having an interview with us. Mr. Carter is the admissions counselor in one of the best-known American academies, which is the Crankbrook Academy. And today we are going to have a talk about the admissions applications and admissions process overall for international students, and a little bit about writing the personal statements. The first question is, could you tell us a little bit about the academy you work, which is Crankbrook Academy? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Yes, I work at Cranbrook, the Cranbrook School. We start with essentially like 4-year-olds who live in the nearby area, and offer schooling all the way up through, what for us is 12th grade. It sounds like for you all it's 11th grade. And so some students have been here their whole lives. Those are generally the students that live nearby. Starting in high school, we open up into a boarding school. And so about, maybe 15% of our students are international students, coming mostly, in my experience, from Asia and Africa, and so we have a lot of students from all over the world, as well as students from all over the country. Another 15 to 20% of our students are boarding students from around the U.S., and then the remaining 60% or so come from close to us. With our nearest big city is Detroit. That's where a lot of the American car companies are. So a lot of the students I work with, their parents work in the automobile industry. Boarding school, just so you all know, are you familiar with the term boarding school?
Yeah, we actually are studying in boarding school as well. The presidential school in Tashkent is a boarding school. So.
Fantastic. Yeah. So then you get the idea of having kids from all over the country come to one place to study. So. Yeah, and I would say outside of the coasts, where New York is and then where Los Angeles is, we're definitely one of the kind of premier boarding schools throughout the middle part of the country.
So your job is the admissions counselor at this academy, right?
Formal title would be college counselor.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. And I work with the admissions counselors at colleges, essentially. So I'm helping the students that are your age here apply to college, pick which colleges to apply to, kind of navigate that whole process. And then the admissions counselors are the ones at the colleges that are reviewing your applications and deciding, which students to offer admission to.
And you mentioned that you have international students in your academy as well. And how do they get in? Is there any scholarships offered to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should also say I previously worked at another boarding school just outside of New York City, which also had a lot of international students there. As I answer questions like this, I'll probably draw from my experiences at both places. That school is Taft, so I'll write that down also. International students, some of our international students are what we would refer to in the business as full pay students. And so that means that they are not receiving financial aid. Other international students are. International students will come through maybe a specific partnership. So here at Cranbrook, we have a partnership with a school in Turkey. And so we'll kind of give an entrance exam, and the students that qualify will offer scholarships to. I don't know how it got set up with that particular school, but it means that every year we've got a couple of Turkish students coming here on either a full or mostly full scholarship. At Taft, I worked with some international students who had athletic scholarships. Our coaches had relationships with various, athletic programs around the world. And so, if students were training through those programs, they could get put in touch with, coaches at boarding schools in the United States, and we would offer them essentially an athletic scholarship to come study with us and then play on our athletic teams. And then there are programs like a program called Assist, which basically helps students look into high schools around the US. And Assist, I believe, also partners with the United World Colleges. And so that is, students there may not end up with a school in the US, but there are 5 or 6 high schools in the US that are kind of part of that program. And Taft, where I worked, was one of them. So there are a lot of different paths that students can take to kind of make contact with these schools. I would say it's rare for a student to apply to a high school in the US without having some sort of, contact or connection or something like that, because it's, you're moving halfway around the world. So you don't want to go in completely blind. I think it's a lot more common for students, international students, to apply to colleges and universities in the US without having any kind of formal connection to them.
Your job is college counselor, and you basically work with students to help them to get into their universities and with the process in general. At which grade, you start working with them, at 9th or 10th?
I start working with students in our 10th grade, which it sounds like is your 9th grade. The past few weeks, I've been meeting with students who are 2 years away from applying to college, just sort of chatting with them, getting to know them. Eventually I'm someone who's going to be writing one of their recommendation letters to colleges. And so I want to have something to say. And so I, get to know them a little bit, and you help them with choosing courses and things like that. Then by the time they're juniors, I'm working with them on putting together a list of colleges to look at, and see when they're seniors, proofreading their essays and, dealing with other aspects of the logistics of applying to college. And so one thing I will say is that college counselors, admissions counselors on the college side, they know in many cases that the level of assistance that students from a school like Cranbrook get may be different from the level of assistance that a lot of students outside the US are getting. And so, they're not going to necessarily expect, that you guys will have had that same hands-on work. I mean, do you have a college counselor at your school?
No, unfortunately we don't, but people like Mr. Alisher are helping us a lot, and we don't have an official college counselor, but we're getting some help.
Yeah, and that's super common, and so again, I think there's maybe a little more leeway in reading an application from a student that hasn't had the formal help. Whereas, if you come to a high school in the US and you're getting, this kind of targeted college help from a younger age, the expectations are going to be higher, that your application's got to be perfect. You all, it doesn't have to be perfect, because they know the difficulties that you all have with kind of going it more on your own a little bit.
I know as well that you have a very good experience in reading international students' applications. You worked in Occidental College, right? And yes, that's the part of your experience that I'm very interested in, and we want to know a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So I did work first in the admissions office at Pomona College, which is where Alisher and I both went to college. There, I occasionally read international student applications. When I moved to the admissions office at Occidental College, which is in Los Angeles, I was the head of the international admissions program. So I would travel to high schools, mostly through Asia and Latin America, and recruit students. And then I read every international student's application who applied to Occidental for the time that I was there. And so yes, that's something I have a lot of experience with and passion for. And part of why I like working at boarding schools in the US is because I still, get to work with international students.
What was the most common mistakes you saw in that international students made on their application?
Particularly for students who are coming from an environment where English is not their first language. It's important to make sure that English proficiency, if not fluency, is there. I think that, certainly some of that is communicated through something like the TOEFL or the IELTS, but it's also in the application that you put together. And so the essays that you write, I would say in general, a lot of students put a lot of time and thought into their main college essay. And so that generally reads pretty well. Students tend to not put as much thought maybe into some of the other written pieces of the application. So there are, as I'm sure some of you are seeing, supplemental essays that some of the colleges have. And if the, writing fluency was markedly different between that and the main essay, then, we could see like they spent a lot of time polishing this one and they kind of maybe dashed off that supplement, and that might be more reflective of who they are, of where their English is at. Similarly, in the extracurricular activity section, right? So you get like 150 characters to write about your activities. You got to make sure that reads really well. Those don't necessarily have to be complete sentences all the time, but you want it to still sound professional, polished. Basically, anything that you write in the essay should be high quality. You should proofread all of it. Just making sure that same level of care is placed throughout. That would probably be the biggest mistake that I saw with international students. One piece really standing out, and the rest of the application maybe not quite having had as much thought.
So when the application deadline has passed and it's time to look through the applications, what's the first thing that admissions counselor look at? Is that the essay of the applicant or the statistics or the recommendation letters from teachers?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. Essentially, we would try to read in what we call school groups. If we had 5 applicants all from the same high school, I would try to read them all at the same time. So that way, I get a feel for what the classes are that students usually are expected to take, and how the recommendation letters read from the teachers at that school. Failing that, I would try to read in country, so try to read all of the applications from Uzbekistan sort of together to get a feel for what students in that country, in that environment are encountering, facing, what kind of opportunities they have, all of that kind of stuff. And when I'm then looking at an individual application, order that we read it in is first, generally, we look at the common application. I was at a school that used the common application, so we would see what you put together. We start off with your words. So looking at your extracurriculars, getting your family background, personal history, reading your essays. And then after that, we would see the transcript that you had, so getting a feel for the classes that you took, the grades that you got. And then after that, we kind of would close with the teacher and counselor recommendation letter. Generally speaking, we would want to let the student present themselves first, and then the teacher and counselor letters are hopefully just confirming the things that we've already kind of picked up through the application. I would say the most important piece generally that we would see is that transcript. So wanting to make sure that you're doing well in the classes. Having a good test score can go a long way. Being really committed in your extracurriculars can go a long way. But the transcript shows what the work is that you've put in on a daily basis, right? And so every single day when you show up to class, the effort that you're putting in and how it pays off in the system that you're in. And so making sure that those are as good as they can be, which I know for those of you who are applying to college right now, that's kind of done, but hopefully you've established a good track record. Fundamentally, particularly at selective colleges, your transcript and secondarily your test scores will kind of put you into the conversation. There are always more students that are qualified than those schools can take. And so then the essays and recommendation letters can kind of help distinguish between folks who have already got the established academic record. With the school that you're at, what is the educational system that you have?
What we have here is the A levels, and together it's mixed with the Uzbek curriculum. So we are expected to get 3 A levels, and the rest of the curriculum is based on the Uzbek curriculum.
I see. Oh, so you're taking classes in addition to the 3 A levels.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, what we would look for there is then the O-level results. If there are grades from the A-levels that have been happening, the sort of progress grades, we would look at those. And then the predicted A-levels from the teachers, to see how you would do. The difference if you're applying to the British system, they'll offer you a conditional admit to see how you do on the A-levels. And then if you, get the level that they think you're going to get, then you get to be admitted. With the US, we're going to give you an offer of admission before those results come in. That's where the predicted A-levels and the grades that you've gotten in the classes, while you're working towards those exams, those matter more for us than they would in the British system.
We know that the school applicant is applying from is also important for admissions officers to know, so that, for example, in our situation, the presidential school in Tashkent was launched only last year, and actually we are the first applicants to colleges. We are going to be the first graduates. So the admissions counselor, admissions officers actually do not know that much about our school. Is that going to affect somehow negatively to the decisions they do?
I think there are positives and negatives to that, right? First, of course, the negative is there's not an established track record. And so, I could look at, schools like the Shanghai American School or the Singapore American School or Colegio Nuevo Grande in Bogota, Colombia, as schools that I would receive multiple applications every year, and I knew the sort of caliber of students that came from them. You all won't have that track record to rely on as a kind of shorthand to say like, oh, we went here, so we must be at least a certain level of good. On the other side of it, though, there's no one else to compare you with. If I got an application from Shanghai American School, I could go back to the years and years of Shanghai American School applicants that I'd had and see like, oh, this student isn't quite doing what those other students were doing. You all don't have that. You're setting the bar in a lot of ways. If you're excelling in this year right now without that historical context, they could be more apt to take that chance. The other thing I would say is that sometimes, I think a lot of colleges want to be able to reel off all of the different countries that are represented in their international student population. That was definitely something that we would think about at Occidental when we were thinking about how to spend our financial aid dollars, for example. And so, I'll say like students from China that needed financial aid weren't going to get it, generally speaking, because we already had so many students from China that were paying everything. We wanted to use that money to add in a country that we maybe weren't getting already. If you all are the only or one of the few applicants from Uzbekistan, then that again gives you some sort of like a geographic diversity that you're bringing to the potential class.
Taking gap years, like I know that in America, a lot of high schoolers decide to take a gap year then to submit their documents later. How that policy works for international students, like is that assumed to be something like negative about the international students, or it is okay for them as well to take a gap year and apply later?
I would say one of the things when I'm talking to students here about gap years is I still recommend that they apply to college while they're in high school. One of the things that you can do is apply to college, get admitted, and then ask if you can defer your admission for a year. And so they may be able to hold your spot. And then that way you can go take a gap year and not have to worry about the college process because you already know that you have a home to come to. I think that with international students, it's understood that not all of the academic schedules align perfectly with the US schedule. So it could be very common for students to, whereas a student might graduate in May or June in the US and start college in August, we know that there are places where students will graduate in December or January and then start college in August. Having a slightly different schedule is something that I think will not surprise colleges. If you are, full on taking an entire year off, I would say the thing that the colleges are going to look for is just why? What are you doing with it? if you're only applying to college in that year, we might have some questions. But if you're taking that year to, earn money to help pay for your college experience in the U.S., if you're, working on English skills or developing some other talent, maybe you have an interesting startup business idea that you want to try out for a while. I think like that is a really understandable reason to take some time. I think that it would make perfect sense in those cases, but you want to communicate that through the application to the colleges to make sure that they know, here's how I'm using the gap year that I'm taking.
So it's essentially important to show them that you haven't spent just for like your gap year just for nothing. Like it was useful for you and there's something.
Right. Yeah, and useful can mean a lot of different things. Like I said, you just getting a job and earning some money can be very useful, and colleges understand that. In a lot of ways, really respect when students do that. I wouldn't worry in some ways about what you think they will find useful, but as long as it's useful to you, as long as there's a reason why you are doing this, and it's not just to relax, if it's to earn money, to help your family, to better yourself in some way, communicate that to the colleges.
And probably it's the topic that is most popular right now because of the pandemic and COVID, test optional policy. How do you think about that? Like if the students are applying without SAT, especially international students, is that going to give them less chance to get in than the ones who are applying with SAT scores?
I may be a little cynical about this. I will say that I never worked at a college that was test optional. So I always read applications with standardized test scores. I think that it can be a really good opportunity for international students. I think particularly, again, because you're coming from a school that maybe doesn't have that history yet, the standardized test scores can be a way to catch a school's eye. If the school you're applying to has an average SAT score of 1350, you apply, and they're like, we don't know this high school, we have no frame of reference here, but they see that your SAT score was a 1450, like, well, there's something here, right? There must be something there with the student. I think the thing with applying test optionally is you're removing that piece of the application, so everything else takes on more importance. If you're going to apply without the test scores, your transcript's got to be great. That's the only thing then that's speaking to your academic ability. Your recommendations have got to be great. Your essays got to be great. All of that can be very possible. And I think, particularly this year, if you really can't take it, I think you would want to explain that in your application to say, here's what the situation is where I live and why I just actually could not take an SAT or an ACT. Colleges will be understanding. They definitely don't want you, risking your health or your family's health just to sit for a test. I would say if you have the opportunity to do so, you can. Getting late in the process right now. So I think that if you haven't taken one, then you probably shouldn't try. Like taking one in February or March is probably not going to come back in time to make a difference with the colleges. And if you haven't taken one now, then I would put that explanation into your application to just make sure that they understand why that couldn't happen. And if you took one and you don't want to share the test score, you can apply to some colleges test optional and then send your score to other colleges, depending on what their average SAT is. Using SAT as the example, you should look at the median SAT score of the college. And if your SAT score is higher than that, send it in. And if it's lower than that, you don't have to send it in, and you may not want to. But that's where I would just make sure if you're planning to not submit a standardized test score, put even more effort into those essays. Really make sure that everything is as perfect as it can be.
How are the things going on with the US high schoolers? Are they most of them are applying with SATs, or many are planning to go test optional?
I would say many are planning to go test optional. I think with the students that I work with, most of them have taken at least one test, but in the US, most students plan to take it multiple times. If they just took one, it may not be what they had been hoping for originally. I know that can be different in other countries. Students may only get one shot to take it, depending on how difficult it is to access. Particularly in the last couple of months in the US, as the pandemic has continued to get worse and worse, we've had to cancel a lot of our tests. And so there are students who are planning on taking a second or a third SAT that can't and aren't going to get the scores that they were hoping for, and so they're applying test optionally. Again, make sure that you're telling that story. Make sure that colleges, because colleges, we don't know exactly how the pandemic is affecting each country out there, and so make sure that they know, here's what the situation is in Uzbekistan. Here's all of the different things I had to do to try to get a test. Make sure that it's not excuses. It's providing them with the context that they need to understand why that score may be missing from your application.
Yeah, obviously you've read a lot of essays from international students, and it may be interesting and it may be exhausting as well, because so what is the most interesting personal statement that you've read so far in your experience that impressed you the most?
A couple of things here. So first, I think students tend to feel like your essay has to be about something huge, some really big moment in your life where everything changed. And it doesn't have to be that way. I've read really fantastic essays that were about very mundane things. Some of my favorite essays that I've read, one was about a boy who was trying to catch a fish with his bare hands. Just one little challenge that he set for himself on a camping trip. Telling that story, he's able to talk about his curiosity and his flexibility, how he overcomes obstacles and what he did to modify his goal and all of that kind of stuff. The way that I talk with my students about essays is the topic doesn't really matter. It's the message that you're trying to get across that matters. What is that thing that you want the reader to take away? I find it can be helpful to know, like when we were reading applications on the college side, my job was to summarize everything in the application for the rest of the members of the admissions committee who couldn't read the whole thing. And I would get generally one sentence to summarize a student's essay. And so a lot of times when I'm working with students, I'll say, what do you want that one sentence to be? What do you want that summary of you say? In the example of the kid trying to catch a fish, I could say trying and failing to catch a fish with his bare hands helped show his adaptability and his creativity, something like that as a summary of that. If you start with what you want that takeaway to be, you can kind of reverse engineer, build out what the essay is that kind of leads the reader to that takeaway. And that can be really helpful for students a lot of the time. But I think ultimately it's less about a student, did this thing or this thing happened to a student, and more about, what are some of those traits that you have, some of those adjectives that could describe you, some of those motivations for why you're interested in what you're interested in or why you do what you do. Those are the really important things that that you need to get across. And the topic is just the vehicle to deliver those messages. And the other thing I'll say with essays is that it can be interesting to see some sort of self-awareness with students about their identities, right? You all, my limited knowledge of your school and your academic setup, right? If you're coming from all over the country, there are different parts of the country with different levels of access, and class can play an issue in things. And how did you arrive at the school that you're at? How are you using those opportunities? That can be very interesting. Again, that may be a topic that would be shared by many students, and that's okay, as long as that message that you're getting across is individual to you and to who you are.
The topic is not the most important part. The important part is how you deliver it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you can literally write a great essay about anything. It's really about sort of what it says about who you are that matters the most, I think.
In Common App, besides the Common App essay, this year we have, like each year we have additional information section, but this year we have the COVID-19 as well. Do you suggest or advise your students to use those sections, like the COVID or the additional information, and for what they should be used?
So the thing with the additional information section in general is it does not have to be a full essay. I tell students all the time, it can be a paragraph, it can be bullet points. It's really just there to convey something to the reader that you couldn't put anywhere else. For example, if you have to talk about the challenges you faced with trying to take an SAT, that can go in the additional information section as just some needed context for reading your application. With the COVID section this year, I think certainly if someone in your family or close to you passed away or had a really difficult experience with COVID, that's something that can and should go in there. I think in general, if you are dealing with some kind of family trauma while also having to get really good grades in school and keep up with your classes, that's important context. To know that while your grades may have dropped a little bit, it was because your dad was in the hospital or something like that. Colleges will want and need to know that. Additionally, the other kind of most common thing that we talk about here is some sort of economic impact. A lot of the world shut down for large chunks of time this year. At least in the US, a lot of people lost jobs or saw their normal wages change. If you or your family was impacted through some sort of economic means that was due to COVID, that's another thing you can and should put in there. So that, again, the colleges understand some of those external stressors that you were facing while trying to do all of the normal teenager school things. The other thing I've seen some students do is write about how being locked down or whatever else they experienced just made them more appreciative of their family or of the opportunities that they had. I wouldn't say that's as necessary to write about, but if that is something that you felt really strongly, if you feel like your experience with this pandemic changed you in some way, you can certainly feel free to write about that in that space too.
I think I can move on to the questions that the audience have. Ainura asked, scholarship essay writing phase often includes achievements. How do you see yourself in 5 years? And these kind of things are asked. And she's asking how such things and such questions can be answered the best way.
Hard for me to answer specifically without seeing the writing prompt. I will always, when I'm working with students and they send me an essay, I'll tell them to also send me the prompt, because even if the prompts are generally the same, there may be certain words or perspectives that differ slightly between them that could impact how you address the answer. So I would say read the prompts carefully, make sure that you are answering every aspect of what is being asked of you. When you're doing an essay about your achievements, it's, I think, most important to talk about why you're doing it, or what you learned from it. How did you grow from this experience? Those kinds of things that you can't get from a typical resume, just listing off what you did. You want to take the opportunity in the essay about your achievements to go a little deeper. And that could be focusing in on one achievement that's particularly important to you. It could be talking about a theme in your achievements. Maybe you want to be a doctor, and so you are volunteering at a hospital and a clinic, and you have a lot of activities that kind of follow the same thread. That's another way you could do that, but you want to get into that, why you do what you do and how you grew from it. In terms of how you see yourself in 5 years, personally, I hate those questions because there's no way to know. Probably what they're getting at, particularly if it's a scholarship, the organization that is sponsoring the scholarship is, in a way, investing in you. And so they want to know that this investment is going to pay off, however they define that. They're probably looking for your motivation. you have big goals and big dreams, and that you're going to work as hard as you can to achieve them. You don't necessarily have to meet those goals. Just having that mindset that you're trying for something big means that whatever you do, you'll end up doing something big. Even if you don't have a specific plan, that's okay, as long as they see that you're hungry.
The Common App also has the part with activities, but some colleges have also the part where they ask, if you want, you can put your resume. And basically sometimes the resume and the activities part says the same thing. So what do you suggest to do? Like if I put my resume, should I remove my activities, or they both should stay there?
Well, definitely don't remove your activity. That the part in the common application should be filled out as completely as possible. It's okay if there's overlap. It can be a space to maybe include some of those things that didn't make the cut for your activities list. The activities list in the common application is 10 spots. So if you had other things in there, maybe you did a club for a year that wasn't, significant enough to make the common app, throw it into the resume, make sure that they get the full story that way. It's not going to be the piece that makes or breaks your application. The things that you do, the activities that you do, those are going to be really important. How you format a resume, or the sort of 12th and 13th activities that you squeeze into the resume, that's ultimately probably not going to be the deciding factor between you getting admitted and not. So I think it can be good to, again, do the optional thing to show that you're interested. Make sure that it, is proofread and that it reads really nicely and all of those kinds of things that I was talking about earlier. But I wouldn't stress on that as much as I would more on the big essays that you're writing.
Shafkat, who's applying to a PhD program, so a very different topic.
Yeah.
And he had a lot of questions that I think were kind of answered, COVID-19 related stuff, not submitting your GRE. I think a lot of what you said, Carter, applies. But he had a great question, which is, how do you find a supervisor at a university? I.e., how do you find an advisor, an academic advisor? What should you think about when you select basically a mentor for your PhD program? But I think this also applies for a bachelor's degree.
Yeah, and I'll say so. I don't have a PhD, but I got a master's from the University of Texas at Austin here in the US. And so I did a kind of grad school application. And I'll try to also answer this in a way that fits with those applying to undergraduate programs. I think in general, again, the expectation is going to be lower for you coming from so far away, from not having the same connections that folks might have in the US. I think at the very least you want to identify some mentors that you would love to work with. A lot of the times it's based on research. So, if you're applying to a PhD program, ideally you have some question that you want to get answered, some idea of the research that you want to engage in when you get to graduate school. And if you can find professors that are addressing that topic or research like it, that's what you're looking for. I was in media studies when I went to graduate school, having an idea of what I wanted to study, and then trying to find programs that did that thing were the biggest thing for me. Essentially writing to that professor about, here's why I want to study with this person, here's all the things that I bring to the table, and how studying with this person can further the research that I want to do, the goals that I want to achieve. I think that you could certainly reach out via email to people like that. I wouldn't necessarily email them and say, will you be my mentor? But I would email them and say, I'm interested in these topics. I'm applying to the PhD program here. Do you think this would be a good fit for me? What sorts of resources do you all have in this area? And start the conversation that way and see if they write back, and start to try to do that, so that when your application comes up in the review process that they at least have some sort of familiarity and background with you. Similarly, with applying to undergraduate places, a lot of schools are going to ask, why do you want to come here? Why are you applying to Duke or University of Chicago or Pomona College, whatever it is? And to be able to say, you don't have to say it this way, but one thing you can say is, I care a lot about international relations, something like that. At Occidental, they have now a program with the United Nations where students can spend a whole semester at the United Nations, and the professor that runs that used to be an ambassador to Finland or somewhere. To be able to say, I really care about international relations. I want to work with this guy who used to be this ambassador because that's my goal, something like that can be a great way to show that you've done research about your undergraduate institution and that you've made that connection between yourself and the school that you're going to. Again, it doesn't have to be as specific as those going to grad school where you really, really want to hone in on the details around a specific professor or two, but being able to connect your interests to the schools that you're applying to still is something you want to do in some capacity at the undergraduate level, especially if they have those supplemental questions that ask, why are you applying to this college? I also know, Tim, you had talked about maybe financial aid as a topic of concern, or the questions might come up.
As we know, the Css profile is the most important part of financial aid for American universities, right?
For those universities that have it, yeah, some places that you apply to may not. So the Css profile, generally, if you're applying to highly selective colleges or colleges that have a lot of their own money to give out, that is really important. Generally speaking, if you're looking for need-based scholarships, you're going to be looking at schools with Css profiles. If you're applying to a place without that, it means they're generally they're looking for you to pay full freight. So yeah, that'll be a thing. There's also one thing that we used a lot was the International Student Financial Aid Application, ISFAA. And that was generally where students would also kind of demonstrate their, what financial resources they had and things like that. That's important also because not only does the institution have to decide how much money they can give you and will give you, but they're going to be sponsoring your student visa to the US government. And so they have to be able to say, here's how this student is going to pay for this and continue attending college over the 2 to 4 years.
In order to get the money, it's important to apply to universities which are need-based, right?
There are very few colleges in the United States that are need blind for international students. Harvard is one of the 5, I think, where they're just going to look at everybody's application. They're not going to take into account how much money you need, and they're just going to admit who they think is the best and worry about paying for you later. Most schools in the US that offer financial aid to international students, they're going to be what we refer to as need aware. When I was at Occidental, and I don't know if this is the same now there, I was basically told that we had money for 2 full scholarship international students a year. And so I could break that up into 4 half scholarships, or I could, do 1 full scholarship and 2 half scholarships. I had a kind of pot of money to worry about. Basically, I was reading all of the the students with financial need together and trying to figure out, who do I want to spend this money on? Ultimately, because I had such a low amount of money, it was harder to get financial aid from Occidental as an international student than from Harvard, because there were so many fewer spots. A school like Pomona College, where Mr. Alisher and I went, has a lot more money for international students. And so you'll see maybe small colleges like that are looking at 10 to 20 students a year that they're giving full rides to. Bigger colleges like Columbia and Dartmouth, those are places you may have heard of. They may have 50 scholarships that they're giving, but ultimately, yeah, they're going to be looking at you in the context of other students around the world who need money and decide who are we going to give this money to. It's very competitive. This is why you want to make sure everything's as good as it can be in the application, and to recognize that if you don't get a certain school, they're really hard to get into. And so not to take that too personally.
Main difference between need blind and need aware is that need blind do not really mind about your money, but while need aware have the specific amount of money that they are going to give to international students, right?
Right, exactly. And so they are considering how much money you will need. A lot of times with international students, I'll tell them as the more that you say you can pay, I mean, you have to be able to pay it, but the more likely you are to get an offer. Unfortunately, if you come in saying I can pay $0, maybe you'll get that full ride, maybe you won't. It was easier for me on the college side to take someone who could pay 10,000 US dollars or 5,000 US dollars. Someone who is contributing something, because then that saves us a little money that we can spend on someone else. I would say however much you're capable of paying, don't hold back. Let them know that you will contribute that, and that'll make you more likely to get the rest that you're looking for.
Can you explain the term in detail? Do you think you will be eligible for in-state tuition? And will you get in when you become the resident of that particular state? And how will they give you the scholarship? What aspects will they look for you to become eligible for that? And what should we choose in the Common App it asks for us to choose from?
Okay, a lot of questions. That's great. So in-state tuition is hard, and it varies from US state to US state. So right now I'm in the state of Michigan. For the University of Michigan, they're very, very strict with what they consider to be in-state qualifications. Students have to have lived in Michigan, I believe, for 5 years. When I was in Texas, it was just 1 year. There are some schools where you can be there for a year as a student and then qualify in your second year for in-state tuition. There are other schools and states where you have to have been a resident of that state for a year prior to enrolling in order to get the in-state tuition. And so each public university is going to be different in that regard. I will say the different levels of tuition, you generally will only see those at public universities in the US, because those state governments are giving money to the school for the students from that state. And so those get the lower dollar amounts. And then the students from outside of that state, whether they're from the US or international, are paying the out-of-state tuition level. Private schools generally are the ones who will have the same dollar amount across the board. They tend to have more scholarships to give out. And so a lot of times when I'm working with students, I'll recommend having a mix of public and private schools. Some of those public schools that may cost a little bit less, but you're probably not going to get a scholarship to. And you'll have some of those private schools where if they take you, they're going to give you a ton of money. And so I would try to balance your school list with those different types of colleges. And, I would also recommend looking at places like Canada or the UK, especially if you're in the British system, because their dollar amounts will be lower. Again, they're not going to often give as much scholarship money, but their dollar amounts are lower if that's something that, you can afford more than the 75,000 US dollars a year that some of the US colleges are. Long way to say in-state tuition is tricky. And I would not necessarily count on it as an international student, but you may find some colleges, and explore this with each public university you look at. You may find some where after your first year living there, you are eligible to get that lower in-state tuition.
Do you think, Carter, that it matters for the Common App how they answer that question?
I guess in short, yes. I think it will matter, because if you qualify for in-state tuition, they're going to read you in a different financial pool, kind of like whether they want your out-of-state tuition dollars more, or whether they know that they're gonna get some help from their state government for you, whatever it is. And this may be the case if you have a parent who lives in the US, or if you used to live in the US and now you live in Uzbekistan. Maybe you have some connections that way to an in-state tuition level. But I would do the research ahead of time before you answer that in the common application. I will say also, if you put it down one way in the common application, you can often change it afterward. I think it'd be a great plan if you aren't sure about whether you qualify, or you can't find the qualifications on the website, email the admissions office. Just the admissions@thatschool.edu. Email them and say, here's my situation, here are the questions that I have. If you march down no on the Common App and they don't get back to you until, January 11th, and they say, actually, you do qualify, then you can often just switch that classification. Be in touch with the office, get the answer to the specific situation that you have and how it applies to that school, fill out the Common App or change the Common App accordingly.
So it's important to make the research before answering the question.
Yes, I think so, just because each school is going to have a very different policy.
Other programs that offer financial assistance that may not be synced as a scholarship, special program or initiatives. Like I know that American students have the chance to participate in QuestBridge or something like that, right?
Right.
That matches students with the universities. Are there some kind of these programs that are available for international students?
The answer, I believe, is no. A lot of times I would encounter things that were specific to a certain country. I don't think this is the case anymore, but for example, Saudi Arabia used to have a list of colleges in the US where they would fund students going abroad to those specific colleges. I think Brazil has a similar thing where, if their students are going to study, science or technology in the US, then they'll fund a certain amount of a student's time there. Reach out to the Education USA chapter in Uzbekistan and make sure that you're not missing out on any potential scholarship opportunities. Education USA in your country will have all of those opportunities. There may be ones at specific schools. So there may be a school that will fund one student from Uzbekistan every year or something like that. But to my knowledge, there is not a kind of general program for any international student from anywhere in the world.
Hello, Mr. Carter.
Hello.
So my question is, if changing the major impacts to scholarship, like I have studied for an economist and I have economic background, and while studying, I changed my mind, and now I want to study my master's for a developer. Will that, and my question is, will that changing mind affect the financial aid?
It could. Again, one of the jokes that we have in college admissions is the answer to every question is basically, it depends. And that's funny to us and probably not as much to you, because it means that you're having to reinvent the wheel every time that you research a college. In looking at graduate programs, by developer, I assume you mean like computer developer.
Yeah.
Okay. If you're talking about a master's, again, in my experience, the scholarship opportunities for masters in something like that are more limited because they kind of expect that you're going to make more money with that afterwards. And so you can take out loans and then pay them back rather than take scholarships. With a PhD program, again, in my experience, there tend to be a lot more opportunities for you to be paid. Either way, if you're applying to graduate school, you would want to see, generally they'll give you money or allow you to study for free. If you are also being a teaching assistant, that may be a case where if you have a background in the area that you're going to study, then you're going to be a great teaching assistant, and they'll be able to kind of take you in as someone who can do some work for the university while you're studying there. So I would say if you have identified some programs that are specific to what you want, email the university and ask them what scholarship opportunities there are. It will never hurt you to ask that question and to email the admissions office or the graduate admissions office, just to make sure that you're not, again, missing out on any of the opportunities that are there.
Actually, I have a follow-up question on that. You mentioned some universities might expect you to take out loans. As an international student, from Uzbekistan, you don't have access to that kind of credit.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to finance your education in the US by taking out a loan from a financial institution in Uzbekistan. And it's also hard to take out a loan in the US because you have zero credit history and who knows if you're going to disappear. So have you seen that happen where a student coming from abroad was able to finance their education using borrowed money in the US?
Yeah, I would say that it is rare. And I think that exact thing you talk about, if someone is willing to come to school in the US and then never live in the US again, then yeah, you can just kind of run away and not deal with your loan debt. And colleges are aware of that. The situation where you may be able to encounter this is if a college is financing, like essentially loans you the money rather than going through a financial institution. Some colleges will do that, you know, where you're paying them back, or maybe it's college sponsored. It would be rarer. It's possible. I think some places do that. Again, I wouldn't count on it.
For undergraduate degrees, when you're applying to scholarships, does your major matter when considering for a scholarship? For example, if the computer science students majors are more prone to get the scholarship rather than the other majors, because they will be more like popular and they will earn more when they graduate rather than the other graduate.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say in general, the scholarship money wouldn't be impacted by that choice, but your odds of admission could be. I don't know. For example, if every student that I read from Uzbekistan is interested in the computer science major, and then I have one student who's interested in philosophy, and that's maybe not a department that we have a ton of students in, you know, so every department that a school has, the admissions folks are always looking for students to be in that major, you know, so that they can justify paying those teachers and, you know, keep those teachers happy and all of that. There are times, you know, when I was working at Pomona, for example, you know, we had a classics major, right, where you study the old Latin and Greek texts. We had a Russian language major. These were some of the majors that were the least popular majors among the student body. When we had a student that had an interest in that, and was clearly not just saying that to like get our attention, but you know, had taken classics courses before, and we knew they would come in and add to this department, that was something that we would take into consideration. You know, whereas the most popular majors, economics and biology and, you know, those kinds of things, that doesn't stand out as much. Again, that's probably not going to be the case most of the time. At most schools, especially the schools where all the majors are in the same college or the same school, you know, they just want the best students. And I think a lot of times they know that students are going to change their minds and switch majors. And so we don't put too much stock into that, but there could be cases where if you're applying to a particularly rare major, that it could help, maybe.
If a student wins a scholarship, like outside the university from an organization, does it reduce his financial aid package?
That is a great question. There are some schools where it will not reduce the financial aid package. At Occidental, if we had a student that was bringing in an outside scholarship, we would consider that part of what they were bringing to the table. And so we would take financial, like money away from that student's scholarship because we wanted to use that money to fund another student who didn't have the outside scholarship. I don't like that because I don't think it incentivizes students to get outside scholarships. What you want to ask of your colleges is if outside scholarships are stackable. Are they going to stack them on top of your financial aid from the university? And in which case it will lessen the amount of money that you're bringing to the table. Or if they're not stackable, then that means that it just replaces the money that the university would have given. I think you should reach out to each school, and that's the question that you would want to ask, because different schools do it differently.
What's the possibility that we can get to transfer from low US university to a highly ranked US university?
I would say it's a possibility, but it's a low possibility. Generally, so transfer decisions are made after first year admission decisions are made. If at Occidental again, if I spent all of my financial aid budget for international students on incoming first year students, then I didn't have anything else left for transfer students. If I didn't spend all the money, then I might have something left. In the time that I was there, we had one student in the whole school who was an international student with financial need who had transferred in. It's possible, you know, if you are bringing something to the table that the school really likes, And again, one of the things that you all have going for you, I believe, is that a lot of schools don't have Uzbekistan on their list of represented countries, and so they may be interested in adding that in with someone who is bringing a lot of talent in other ways to the university. I wouldn't count on it. It's going to be tougher to make happen. I mean, a school like Princeton in the U.S. only last year, I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, took any transfer student for the first time in like 20 years, U.S. or international. Some years when I was at Pomona, depending on how the first year student enrollment went, some years we took 20 transfers from around the US and the world. Sometimes we took 0 because we had enrolled too many students and we just didn't have enough beds. It can really vary from school to school, from year to year. It's not something that I would count on, but it might happen.
The last question, can there be an agreement with the university about paying the tuition fee later on from your salary as a percentage from your paycheck? I guess that would be the loan, right? The loan that you get.
This is a new kind of thing that started coming up a little bit more because there are some of the loans are so difficult in the US, can be so much money that I don't remember the term for it, but some colleges have said that, they're going to let you go for free and then they'll take maybe 10% of whatever your salary is for the first 7 or 8 years after you graduate, something like that. And so, if you become a teacher and you don't make a lot of money, then they'll just take 10% of that. If you, become an investment banker, then they'll take 10% of that. This is another one I don't know how it would work with international students. I think if you got a job with an American company, it would be very easy to do. I think if you, went back to Uzbekistan and, was working with a company that had no connections to America, it could be easy to, again, kind of not have that happen, and maybe the schools wouldn't want to do that. So if some schools will have that plan, and that's another case where I would email the school and ask, would this apply to me as an international student too?
So, Mr. Carter, I guess that's it. It's time to wrap it up and to finish our session.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. I will say, Mr. Alisher has my contact information. I would be, if you all think of questions that you didn't get a chance to ask here, send them to him. He'll send them to me, and I'll be able to answer them still. Yeah, so I'd be happy to kind of keep the conversation going if anyone wants to.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. It was nice to meet you again.
Yeah,
thank you for the answers. It was really useful for all of us, and we got a lot of new information, especially about the writing personal statements. And thanks for sharing your experience.
Great. It was it was a pleasure. Take care. Good luck, everybody.